welcome to the London Society webinar, Open Not Open. This is all kind of part of this year's theme of connections, and I guess how we are collectively connected by land use, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, we can talk more about that later. But essentially, we've got three great speakers tonight to explore the subject of open land and whether land in London is open, accessible and equitable. So, and I think, you know, there's been a lot of headlines recently about golf courses, partly due to Russell, who's on this this event. But you know, who London is for is a really interesting topic, and it's quite an old one, and I think it will be going into the future as well. Is who can access various spaces and who feels able to go into spaces, whether they're kind of supposed to be public or not. So without further ado, I will introduce you to the speakers tonight. First up, when they do their presentations, we'll have Russell Curtis. Russell is a founder of RCKa, an award-winning architecture practice. They've won Housing Design Awards and Social Impact Awards. And he is also a founding director of Project Compass, which you may or may not have heard of, which is a not-for-profit organisation that campaigns for better procurement. He's a member of the LLDC Quality Review Panel, Croydon's Place Review Panel, Newham's Design Review Panel, and he's a Mayor's Design Advocate. So I'm sure he's quite busy with all those roles. After Russell, we'll have a presentation from Dinah Bornat, another Mayor's Design Advocate, if that's correct. Yeah, but on top of that, she's an architect and co-founder of ZCD Architects, who are based in East London. ZCD are motivated to design the best possible places for people, and they do a lot of work with child-friendly cities. Their design approach is underpinned by a body of research and augmented on each project by high-quality youth engagement. And you know, I think community engagement is becoming, it's more than a buzzword now, it's becoming more and more popular all the time. As well as being a design advocate, she also sits on, I think it's a number of design review panels. I had a list somewhere before. Maybe she can elaborate if people need to know. And then the third speaker on our list is Bridget Snaith. Am I pronouncing that correctly? And Bridget is part of the landscape faculty at University of Sheffield. She's recently moved from the University of East London. And she's also a partner in the landscape design practice SHAPE, and another organisation that works with community and third sector organisations, councils, housing associations, often working with underused and sometimes bleak urban open spaces. So I think Bridget's going to be perfect for tonight's talk. She's also done a PhD looking at the reasons for underrepresentation of people of colour and minority ethnic backgrounds in the UK in parks and green spaces. And she's written a book, I believe, on the Olympic Park. No, just a PhD, looking at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which I'm particularly interested in because it's one of my local parks. And I'll tell you all later how much I use it or not. So I think, hopefully, we've got some people in the digital room, and so we shouldn't waste time on me. So let's begin with Russell, and he can share his screen and get us started.
Thank you, Rob. Rob, can you just let me know if you can see that on screen now?
I can indeed see it.
Great stuff. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for coming along this evening. This is a very, very quick summary of a piece of research that I published last year in the summer, which received quite a lot of coverage and sort of stimulated an interesting debate around open space. And it was really the product of some lockdown and walking around where I live in North London, right on the edges of the city, and during my lunchtime walks, coming across bits of land that were I couldn't walk across, so fenced off golf courses, and I started to think, well, how many of these golf courses are there? and through sort of going through a mapping exercise, various sort of data sets from from Ordnance Survey and places like that, pulled together a map of all the courses across London. And this, what I'm showing you, is a sort of a product of the research that I did into this sort of phenomenon. So across the city, there are 96 active golf courses, and those are owned by a range of public and private organisations. And if you add them all together, they take up an area around 4,133 hectares of land. And the publicly owned courses, the ones that you can see there in orange or red, occupy a space of around 1,600 hectares. Now, Brent itself, the whole of Brent, is slightly smaller than all of the golf courses added together. So it is a huge area of land that we're talking about here. If you look across green space in London, it comprises a range of different uses. Public parks or gardens, as you'd expect, take up most of that space, and playing fields around half. But golf courses alone take up nearly 5,000 hectares of land, which is a huge amount compared to other leisure uses. So these are the figures. But it's the sort of largest, the third largest use of land in London. Just quickly looking at some of the boroughs, I've handpicked a selection of boroughs to give you an idea of of where these things are. So Bromley has the greatest number of courses of all the London boroughs. It has 11 active courses, 3 of which are owned by the council itself. Added together, these cover an area of 600 hectares, which is 4% of the borough's total area. Richmond, in the other corner, the other south corner, has the highest proportion of its land taken up by golf courses. 7% of the total area of the borough is given up to golf. 3 of these, totaling 88 hectares, are owned by the council. Ealing, another West London borough, has 6 active courses with a total of just over 200 hectares, which is nearly 4% of the total area of the borough. The freehold to 3 of these is owned by the council, and 178 hectares of golf course in Ealing are designated as Metropolitan Open Land. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a second. So Metropolitan Open Land, or MOL, is a specific planning designation which is unique to London. Enfield, finally, 7 golf courses, 4 of which are owned by the council, and the area occupied by its 4 golf courses are total 180 hectares, which is roughly the same as the council is currently proposing to take out of its green belt in order to meet housing need. Just zooming in a little bit to take a typical golf course. This is Enfield Golf Course, close to the town, close to the centre of Enfield and close to Enfield High Street. Enfield Council owns the freehold and leases it to the golf club, and in return, the golf club pays £13,500 rent per annum. Yet Enfield has 10,500 people in temporary accommodation and 4,400 households on its waiting list. These things are huge. If you drop Wembley Stadium onto the middle of a golf course, it fits comfortably. You can fit Brent Cross, you can fit the Excel Centre, one of London's biggest buildings, in the middle of it. So the scale of these spaces is ginormous, and I don't think a lot of people who are not golfers appreciate quite how big they are. Now, the dots that I've added there are Metropolitan Open Lands. So as I said, this is a planning designation unique to London. It's captured within the London Plan that prohibits development on open space. It's basically like Greenbelt, but not around the edge. It covers spaces within the city boundaries. So the entire Enfield Golf Course is designated as MOL. And 50% of the course lies within what's called the Policy H2 zone. So this is an area identified within the London plan as being highly accessible, so suitable for incremental intensification. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but that's basically a map of MOL across London. So you can see that it falls within London's boundaries, and it's different from Greenbelt. So just under 10% of London's total area, and 10% of that is given over to golf. Now, according to the London plan, MOL must fulfil a series of different criteria. It must, in order to be designated. So it must contribute to the physical structure of London, as in its built-up form, distinguishable from the built-up area around it. It must include open-air facilities, particularly for leisure, which serve either the whole or significant parts of London. And I've underlined, this is my emphasis, but it's I've underlined that for a reason. And it must contain features or landscapes of either national metropolitan value, or it must be part of a green chain, which is a connection of open space, green open space, and meet one of the above criteria. The Policy H2, as I mentioned, it basically measures accessibility to public transport and high streets, and this is quite a useful metric for assessing areas of land which are easily accessible and perhaps suitable for development. So that's the area of the London Plan Policy H2 across the whole of London. And you can see here the areas of golf courses that fall within that zone. So about 1,600 hectares of land, of golf courses, sorry, fall within the Policy H2 area. So looking at golf courses in total, and the proposition within my research wasn't really about housing, but it's worth asking the question. If you built within the Policy H2 zone, the reason I'm using this H2 zone as a useful metric for assessment is because clearly, golf courses, a lot of them are in the green belt or inaccessible public transport, and they would never be suitable for anything other than some type of leisure or open space use. But it seems strange to me that golf courses should be in areas which are highly accessible for housing or other uses. So you could house over 100,000 people just within that zone alone. And I think with innovative design, you could also maintain the integrity of the MOL in terms of its difference from open space, from built-up space, improve biodiversity, and also deliver significant social value. To take an example, this is Regent's Park. If you turned Regent's Park into a golf course, it could only be used by 105 people at the same time, or around 350 people per day. Yet in 2007, the latest figures available, it averaged around 26,000 daily visitors. So golf courses just are not accessible, not usable by a significant number of people simultaneously compared to the amount of land they take up. Crudely, for every one golfer, you could house 380 people. As I said, this research got quite a lot of coverage in the national press last year. It's worth having a look at this piece in the Guardian if you can find it. But at the end of the day, golfers are not starved for places to play. Even if you got rid of all of the golf courses within London, which is clearly not what I'm proposing, but if you did, there'd still be 74 further golf courses within 5 kilometers of London's outer edge. So my question, really, my proposition is, are golf courses in a city like London, where we're so constrained for space, we're so constrained for housing, and we have a housing affordability crisis, is it right that a land use which is enjoyed by so few and inaccessible to so many exists in such quantities? You can have a look at the full piece of research with a directory of every borough and a map of every golf course on my website there, golfbelt.russellcurtis.co.uk. Thank you very much. I appreciate that's been a really quick rattle through the work, and I hope it made some sense. That's it from me. Rob, are you still there?
I'm here. I'm just going to hand over to Dinah.
Straight into me, yeah?
Straight into you, Dinah.
Here we go.
Just say while people are listening, keep them questions coming and comments all being logged.
Okay, here we go. Oops. Come back. Sorry, come back, Zoom.
Excellent.
Right, that was not as smooth as I'd hoped. Okay, so I'm going to pick up on a few things that Russell said. This idea of this kind of open space and how we might use it. This is our practice. Well, it was our practice last summer anyway. And I'm going to go to the next slide, which is kind of one of the things that I do in my spare time, quite a lot of my spare time actually, is work with a children's charity and do lots of sort of outdoor education and training and spend time in the kind of great outdoors. And this is a space that actually the charity is lucky enough to own, and some young people here who are training to be staff members by playing are kind of enjoying this sort of vastness of space. It's a really interesting topic, how young people enjoy and face challenges in the spaces around them. And I think that this presentation isn't really so much going to be a series of kind of bullet points from our work, if you like, but more a sort of observation of the stuff that we're hearing from young people and what might be important to them. I'm going to venture, but I don't know, that people of this age, teenagers, aren't the ones that are mostly using golf courses. And I suppose my proposition might be that the space that is being given over to some people could be hugely enjoyed by others who aren't getting much access to it. At the other end of the spectrum is the story also in The Guardian, but not written by me, but that I was involved in, which was the segregated play areas in the Lillian Bayliss estate, which appeared in The Guardian a few years ago. Essentially an estate where there's a kind of quite negative culture about allowing children to play out, and a set up through the management of the open spaces that are shared between a housing association and a private landowner, where they literally built this wall in between the two ownerships, so that children who still go to the same school, as you can see by the piping on their uniforms, aren't allowed to play together, because unless you're really able-bodied, you have to climb over that wall to be able to get into each other's spaces, and not surprisingly, they're not very welcome. So that photograph was taken, and then the next day a builder arrived and knocked a hole in that wall and put in a gate, and then the London plan changed, and we all collectively decided that we had missed this loophole, and that actually this kind of walling in and segregating of space was something that was sort of deeply cynical and not something any one of us wanted to sign up to. But what I think it illustrated is what Russell was talking about, this how contested space is in London, and how difficult it is for young people to kind of freely enjoy open spaces for a multitude of reasons. But one of those reasons is that there's just not an abundance of it. So we argue over the scraps. When we work with young people, in fact, when we work with any ages, we have a way of sort of measuring how people feel about space. And instead of sort of saying, do you like this space or not like it, we ask people to think about whether they feel a space might feel green, amber or red according to a traffic light system. And it's a very sort of simple way of thinking about your enjoyment of that space, whether you're free to do what you want to do in it or whether it's very restricted. Obviously green is the same as the color we use for like you know, green and grass and trees, but in this instance you just need to apply it to the traffic lights and think about whether a big wide open space to a young person or anybody else might feel very green, and usually it does. It gives them the freedom to do what they want, and they would like a balance. Most people in our lives would like a balance of, you know, open sort of free spaces and then spaces which might offer you some sort of activities or support, and then acknowledge that there's some requirements for some red spaces that might need to get you there in a road or a rail, and perhaps some bits that you might not be able to get to but might enjoy looking at. But not enough green and amber, and certainly not enough green space, is not very good for our sense of well-being. So we ask young people when we're looking at their neighbourhoods to tell us where these spaces are green, amber and red. And here's some young people filling in some surveys here for a space that is in Poplar in East London, in Tower Hamlets. And then on the right hand side, a park in Brentford. I'm showing you that one on the right hand side because there's a sign that's in the background. And if you look closely, it says that the play area is for under 12s only, which is sort of typical if you look around any kind of open spaces, that we segregate space by age, and that once you hit 12 years old, you're deemed too old to play in these spaces, which is a bit of a paradox because most developments don't have enough space for over 12s to use under the 10 square meters per child rule, and they're expected to go within 800 meters of their home to access a local space. This is the space that is designated for their use on a number of development sites around Brentford, but has this sign up. So exactly where are young people supposed to go? Another thing that we've observed when we're out and about with them is that this age group, and this young woman here is, I think, about 13 years old. The one on the right, he might only be 11, but they still have like a really high propensity to want to play. So similarly to those teenagers that I showed you in the first slide, they really want to enjoy the spaces that we provide, but like I said, they're often just given the wrong signs and the wrong signals that they're not for them. So we know there's a demand, we know they want it, and we know that it's also not serving other groups as well. This is a walk I actually went on today over in Hammersmith and Fulham, in a park with a group of mums whose older children now all have complex learning and physical disabilities, and they're explaining to us how they might need to use open space and how they're not allowed to by the rest of us who are judging them and feeling that they shouldn't be in the open spaces because they're making strange noises or they're behaving in strange ways. So this space we're being shown, which is Little Wormwood Scrubs, is somewhere that they are able to enjoy themselves in, and these spaces are really few and far between, and this kind of vastness, this space and ability to get away from people is really important to them. And I'm just going to finish this with this one slide, which wasn't made for this presentation, but was some observations from a project in Kingston, where we wanted to hear what was great about their local area. And this is the word cloud on the left, where we find the word that pops up the most, and that word is open. Openness of space is something that's massively important to young people, and I'm quite interested in exploring that more with them. What does it mean when they talk about a space feeling open, and why is it so important to them? And then on the right hand side, talking about what's great about their estate, the spaces and the things that they do, the way they can roam and play manhunt, for example. There's lots of green space. You can ride your bike, you can climb. We're talking about an inner city post-war housing estate, but the way in which they want to be able to use this space and the way in which the new development will constrain their use of space is concerning. And I think what I would end with is this thought of the fact that if we do have so much vast open space on our doorstep, don't we need to know what the needs of Londoners are and how some people could be hugely benefiting from it who probably haven't set foot on a golf course in their life? So That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I think it's over to you now, Bridget.
Thanks, Dinah. Let's see if I can share successfully. Let me know if you can see the first slide.
That's looking great. Thank you, Bridget.
Okay, great. Well, so this is an image of a park that we were working with a number of consultants on a scheme there. We were looking at the Equalities Impact Assessment for parks and open spaces in Croydon. And this is Ashburton Park, which was one of the parks that Croydon Borough asked us to take a look at to see how it could be made more open to representative population, because they found that their parks and green spaces were very much widely used by people of white ethnic backgrounds, but less members of different minority ethnic backgrounds or people of colour were using parks and green spaces or joining in with the friends of groups and so forth. And also they were very concerned to see a secure future for the parks, because they had very limited resources for maintenance of their green spaces, and they were looking to think about, for example, things like charging for the use of tennis courts as a way to generate revenue in order to maintain the spaces. And on this image, I've just put a quote from Julian Agyeman, who is a Black British geographer, who is the co-founder of the Black Environment Network in the 1990s in the UK, and has gone to work in the States in order to really further his career because of issues that he's experienced really in environmental sectors around race, and yeah, that he's got more freedom to explore his topic of social justice in the US. And he says we need to give as much attention to fostering belonging, recognition, reconciliation, difference, diversity and inclusion as we do to developing prescriptions for what our cities can become: smart, sustainable, biodiverse and resilient. And I think this is a really good sort of moment just to reflect on the focus very much in certainly landscape professions tends to be around sort of technical accomplishment. And we're not spending, I think, enough time to kind of consider the cultural content of the natures that we recommend or that we produce, or the green spaces that we manage, to ensure that they are equally open to people with different cultural or religious needs. So we all know nature's good for us, and there are different ways in which it provides a healthy environment, a healthy urban environment. So, you know, there are benefits that we'll get whether we like a green space or not. For example, green spaces help us to deal with the impacts, negative impacts of climate change. They help to keep urban temperatures down. They help to absorb rainfall, and we know we're going to have high intensity rainfall events. It helps to filter the air and the water, and it provides biodiversity for resilience, if nothing else, but also which helps us with finding different food resources, seeking different medicines, etc. So biodiversity is a vital part of the kind of passive benefits that people can gain from natural spaces in cities. And what we've seen as well is improvements to health and well-being from more interactive benefits from the green spaces that we choose to interact with. There's lots of research that you can look into about how contact with nature, even just looking out of the window, can help to reduce stress, can allow patients who are recovering from operations to use less pain relief. It provides us with an opportunity for more exercise and so forth. But if people are not able to get into those spaces, or if they have a feeling that those spaces are not for them, then they're not getting equal access to those health benefits that we can derive from nature. And English Nature have been doing a survey every year since 2009, and this is specifically looking at under 16s in households, from households claiming UK white ethnicities compared to households who would claim UK Black, Asian or minority ethnicities, and the frequency of their visits, the numbers of people from those households who would visit the natural environment once a week. And in this survey, they include urban parks and green spaces and sports pitches, etc. But in general, what they found since they started doing the survey is that people who would claim UK Black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds do not have as much access or do not access green space as frequently, and they're working hard to try to understand what they can do to try to ensure more equitable access. So I've been researching this area and working on equalities impact assessment for green spaces for several years. And from the research that we've been doing, there are 3 interacting factors that I've identified that influence whether people will choose to go to a green space or not. And if you only act on 1 or 2 of those, then people may still not be able to come to the space, even though you feel like you've provided for them. So the first factor is whether it's viable. Is it close to where they are? Can they actually physically access it if they have needs for mobility impairment? Is the cost prohibitive? And also, are there any religious or cultural restrictions that would limit their ability to use that space? The second factor is whether or not the space is seen as likely to bring health benefits, whether it's healthful. So some spaces for some groups might feel very healthful, but for others may seem very stressful. Some people find particular environments visually refreshing and are reminded of perhaps countryside or childhood, or have nostalgic feelings generated by particular spaces. And those same spaces can be seen by other people to be unhygienic or dangerous. And then there's the question of whether the space actually offers facilities or activities or preferences that people have for the use of that space. So looking at what I might mean by viable, well, one factor that's been fairly well publicised, Urban Green Nation, was published by CABE in 2010, and they showed that in areas where more than 40% of the population would claim a Black, Asian or UK minority ethnic background, there's 11 times less green space compared to areas where residents are largely white. And so actually physically being able to get to green space is an issue for many people from those backgrounds. But even when green space is available, it might not be viable for certain groups to use it. And one issue in particular might be the issue of dogs running off the lead. And that does tend to be a thing that we see a lot in UK green spaces, which isn't as common in other areas of the world. And for Muslims, some Muslims who cover, the dog mouth parts, if it touches their clothes, the clothes then have to be washed before you can pray, because saliva from the dog is seen as unclean in religious grounds. And if you're having to pray 5 times a day and you have to wash the clothes of yourself and your children 7 times before you can pray, that becomes this enormous logistical issue. And so even if you really want to go to the park and the children want to go to the park, if there's an issue with lots of dogs off the leads in that space or in that countryside space, then that space isn't really open to you in the same way. So what is healthy nature? And thinking about what might be healthful, this image represents a number of images that people will see. And this one was from a story on how nature is good for health and happiness. But this woman sitting alone in this open space with no kind of visible city in the background doesn't actually make everybody feel safe and secure. And this is quite a romantic idea of kind of escaping the city into some sort of semi-natural romantic environment. For some people, even just in general, women have reacted to this to say, well, I wouldn't feel safe if I was alone in a big open space like that. But for very many reasons of social inequality, people who have most power will feel quite differently about experiences in isolation to those who have less power. And the rights to space are contested, and people are very, well, determined about retaining their rights to access to space. So further to that, then, thinking about this sort of idea of maybe healthfulness, but also of interest. This is a piece of the research that I did for my PhD. And this is looking at people's preferences for park space. And I asked in a questionnaire to 230 people from different ethnic backgrounds, if these parks were all 10 minutes from your home, which would you prefer to use? Or which would you choose to visit the most, sorry. And then I've arranged here the images in relation to the different ethnic groups that the participants claimed, different ethnic backgrounds. And the responses to the right are those which are the preferences largely of white British participants. And those images down the left are largely those which were the preferred parks and green spaces for people from other British ethnic backgrounds. The most popular amongst everyone was St James's Park, and the most liked by white British participants and least liked by many others was the image of Richmond Park, which sort of shows a winter landscape, a kind of a picturesque, somewhat bleak scene. But it's not just the sort of the visual context, the interest, what people can do there varies. And this is taken from the Croydon survey. So what's possible to do will influence who's there. And these are examples of responses to a question of what makes you go to the park, what takes you to the park in your neighbourhood. And the top reason for respondents who were claiming Black ethnicities would be for children's play and for exercise, almost equally balanced. For the Asian respondents, the response was more children's play. And then for white respondents, children's play was still important, but it was equally important to be looking for a place to walk or to walk the dog. And you can see the number of people who were talking about dog walking from the Asian or Black ethnicities was considerably smaller, but across all three groups, you can see that interest in wildlife was consistent. So what we're looking at here is averages and not individual measures. The patterns emerge from the data. It's not a description or a kind of, you can't look at a person and say, oh yes, this is what they'll think. But what we are, I believe, seeing here is an idea of people perhaps doing what they consider to be maybe legitimate activities that would take them out of their working life or take them out of their family responsibilities to a place where they're actually able to engage with the natural environment. And also people are publicly performing their identity. So I think that's really it, is if we want to see equal access for people, then we need to think about what's possible. We need to think about their feelings of safety and security. And we also need to make it viable for people to get there. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Bridget. That was great. I mean, I've written a huge amount of notes, and there's lots of buzzy activity in the chat as well, and even some questions in the Q&A. So there's a lot to sort of try and contend with. But I'm going to start off because we had an email before the event from Alice Roberts, who's from the CPRE, who are a group who very much focused on sort of I think it's the countryside within London. I think that's the way they define it, which I still don't really understand, but they are very keen on protecting green spaces, which I think almost everyone either in the chat or speaking today seems to be quite passionate about doing. So I think what's really interesting about what Alice was saying to us, because she couldn't make it tonight, was she was really interested in what defines open and not open, because if you put a membership fee on something, does that make it completely inaccessible? Because obviously it provides funding for activities and services. You know, where's the threshold where something is considered not open, which I would probably think is quite subjective. But and you know, and to what point is there a kind of marker of where something is considered a good public amenity and then something is kind of considered not a public amenity? So not easy questions to contend with, but I guess I'll circle back to you, Russell, because you're the longest since you've spoken. But I mean, how do you view that? How do you see this sort of definition of open?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. I think we have to start looking at it as what is one getting, or what is the benefit of that, of what you're paying for, right? So golf, you know, golf is one extreme. I think that the thing is, golf is expensive. It's expensive to play. It's expensive to, you know, to have a set of clubs, and it takes up a huge amount of space. So it feels quite, you know, and you know, it's absolutely right that it is not it's not a leisure pursuit that's limited to one socio-economic group. But I think it's very much a pursuit which is largely enjoyed by people from a wealthier background, given the restrictions on time and money. I think my objection to a lot of golf courses, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we should just get rid of all of them, but it's simply that they are entirely inaccessible. So a lot of these clubs have limited memberships, and the courses are fenced off, and you know, it's open space which is completely out of the reaches of anybody who's not within that clique. Now, you can walk across some golf courses; they have footpaths across across them, but again, it's a bit dangerous if you wander off that, and it feels like that's quite a limited enjoyment. And it's just the sheer amount of space that these things take up. I mean, they're so much bigger than all of the other sort of sports grounds and things that people might use. So tennis courts in London take up hardly any space. Even bowling greens, which is the next sort of tier of sports or leisure within the sort of open space analysis, take up a tiny amount. So it's just the sheer inequality of it that frustrates me.
Yeah, we've also had just to, because we're not only going to talk about golf courses, but it's just interesting that someone said in the Q&A, Matthew Frith, that they can also be very water hungry. So although they can bring great biodiversity to an area, you know, they are sort of, it's an intensive land use as well.
Yes, that's a whole separate discussion, but I question whether they are actually very biodiverse. My analysis suggests that they're actually pretty monocultural. They use huge amounts of water, pesticides, fertilizer, and you know, there are far more biodiverse uses of green space available.
Yeah, and if you're to, you know, watch the film Caddyshack, there's only one gopher, isn't there, that lives on that huge golf course, which is useless. But I mean,
preference.
Yeah. Showing my age as well, actually, with that reference. So I mean, Dinah, I think you know, teenagers, I think you said in your talk that they're unlikely to use golf courses. So I mean, you know, is also kind of, you know, if we're going back to this idea of public amenity and cost, is something that drives them free? Does it have to, you know,
yeah, most of the time they'll be saying, you know, that they want spaces that are free, which is kind of understandable. But I think the other thing is, it's interesting, isn't it? I've walked across golf courses, but I once went onto a golf course with a golfer who was like my great aunt and lived up in Northumberland, and I walked out and I sort of went, oh, I get it. I get why you like this. It's like it's this kind of amazing, I mean, up there on the coast, amazing vast space, and you're out with a friend and you're going for a walk and you're doing something. And I sort of got why she enjoyed it. And I think, well, isn't that a shame that enjoyment of space is limited to to so few people, and that we kind of misunderstand teenagers an awful lot. I mean, as a particular group, but also we can look at other marginalized groups, because they're not really motivated to kind of play with one other friend. They want to enjoy that same space open, and I'm using the word open in my talk to talk about not whether it's closed, I suppose, and you can't get in, but whether it's actually feels big and open and you can enjoy that space. And actually, Bridget, your 2 slides, interestingly, were showing big spaces, right? So the big greenness, whether it's kind of wild or clipped, but both are kind of big, aren't they? Big green spaces. And I think that maybe within us, that all of us in slightly different ways, there's a sort of need to kind of enjoy those sorts of spaces. And that's what I'm hearing from young people. But it's like, well, when do they get that? And if on top of everything else, we're not even like, we're constraining them even more when we go through developments. And if anybody knows a 12-year-old, they're not like so set up that they can kind of go across 800 meters, which is nearly a kilometer away, to kind of like, you know, have their free time. So that ability and opportunity to enjoy big open spaces is just is so rare in London, and is getting harder. And what a shame that, and you've shown us, Russell, that these spaces exist, but only if you want to do that activity, and it costs and. So it's like there must be about 20 barriers in their way to enjoying that. And it feels like it's set up for a certain type of person, moneyed as well, but it's just, I can't see why it's most teenagers and people with disabilities and people with, do you know what I mean? So there's lots of groups, I imagine.
So there's certainly, it's certainly the case that if you're charging for something, then there's going to be an indirect equalities impact on people who are structurally disadvantaged in society, which would include people like teenagers who have no independent income generally, and also people from Black, Asian and UK minority ethnic backgrounds who are overrepresented in low-income communities for structural racism reasons, and also people whose family members have long-term illness or disability. And so there will be an impact which is unfair as a result of charging, even if rates are seen as being reasonable. But one thing that happens, particularly in the States, where I lived for a short while, is the idea of that you have free days. You know, you might charge for access at certain times, but on one day of a month, you get a free Sunday, and people can go and use the facility without having to pay. And certainly when we were looking at the work with Croydon Parks, we were looking at providing times when there was access for particular groups, for young people, either structured or unstructured, and times when it would be free to use the courts, so that it wasn't going to be completely impossible for anyone who didn't have financial resources to be able to use those facilities, but the revenue was still able to be generated. And I think actually that idea of kind of changing things with time, changing things with seasons is less done, you know, in the city and around open spaces than it is perhaps at the beach, where you might see a difference in the winter and the summer. And again, as I say, in parks in the US, you would maybe have free dog walking, people allowed to run the dog off the leash between 8 in the morning and 10 in the morning. And then from 10 o'clock, it's on the leash in the park. So I think there's ways we could do it, but we have just not really thought flexibly about a lot of these things.
I thought that slide was absolutely fascinating, where you showed the different types of space and how people reacted to them. And it reminded me, I was on a judging panel for a local design awards, and the Walthamstow Wetlands was on there, you know, and I was just, you know, I'm very fond of the wetlands. I went, you know, on the first day it opened, really kind of excited about it. And the on the judging panel was a 17-year-old young advisor, and she had very different opinion to the wetlands to me. And it was basically, this isn't for me, this isn't for my friends, we don't go here. What would we do when we do get there? Just walk around and look at some water? Like, what's all that about? So I think that's really interesting. And you talked about different communities liking a sense of activity. So it's just an open bit of grass that's not necessarily going to be a draw for a lot of people, is it? I don't know. So I just wondered, do you think, something like the Olympic Park, there's a lot of things to climb, there's outdoor gym equipment, they've kind of activated it to the max, but is that a equitable space?
Well, so yeah, what the official visitor counts show is that only 1/3 of users of the Olympic Park would claim UK Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds in an area where 60% of residents are from UK Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And my research showed that the North Park was far more overrepresented by white people in the audience than the South Park, which is a more like typical kind of garden-esque with a lot more kind of play features, but also the play is more easy to visually supervise than in the North Park, which actually it's quite hard if you've got more than one child in the North Park play area and you want to keep an eye on them because you don't feel like they're safe. And I think what I also found was that parents had very different ideas about whether their children were safe or not, depending on their ethnic background, and different ethnic groups would allow their kids out or wouldn't, and would allow them to go, 100 meters from the house or wouldn't. And so the idea that all 12-year-olds can go 800 meters unaccompanied to find play is kind of crazy. I mean, it's not most parents don't let their children go out unaccompanied, research shows, until they're 14 at least.
Definitely.
So.
Yeah, I think that you get a real variety, Rob, like the 17-year-old you talked about, because I've talked to teenagers who will say, oh yeah, Hyde Park's better in the winter, Holland Park's better in the summer. That was a recent conversation I had. Like, why? What's it? It's that one's better for walking in, that one's better for sitting in. So I think there's no one, having said teenagers love vast open spaces, there also is variety within that group that always throws you into kind of going, oh, okay, there isn't just one thing. So for some people, yeah, they might just be like, yeah, why would I go there? But for others, it would be like, yeah, I love it. I go there with my friends. We go, we walk around or whatever. So I think I'm definitely hearing from everybody how important parks are. I think we can all agree that everybody finds them really important.
Yeah, it was a good point I think it was in the chat, which was about, badly funded public services. So that's the problem with you might have a park, but the story doesn't end there, does it?
Yeah. Because
as you say, if you're talking about timed dog walking, who's going to enforce that? And if you're going to have, affordable tennis courts, or I don't know, pitch and putt, as we were talking about earlier, that all comes with maintenance fees and staffing issues. I mean, I'm also keen to, a lot of people were very interested in your references, Russell, to Metropolitan Open Land, and the idea that it's supposed to provide a service, but it seems that not much of it does.
No, and one of my arguments is that I believe that a lot of the golf courses have been misdesignated as MOL. I just don't think they fulfil that designation in a satisfactory way. And to be clear, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that that we should just build housing across all the golf courses. I mean, that's clearly ludicrous.
Well, I think wasn't it Patrick Schumacher who said we should just build luxury flats on Hyde Park?
Exactly. So I would set myself as far away from Patrick Schumacher as I could possibly manage. But I think there is a discussion to have, a sensible discussion to be had around whether those areas of open land or open space can work harder and be more biodiverse and more accessible and provide other leisure uses and perhaps allotments, urban farms, and let's be honest, some housing and other structures that might sort of improve the accessibility or enabling development. And what I was really interested in response to the work that I did was how little pushback there was from golfers, and I think golfers recognise that their activity takes up a huge amount of space, and a lot of them would welcome smaller golf courses. You know, if you could take a 40 or 50 hectare 18-hole course and consolidate it down to 20 or 30, and then release the remaining land for some development, some rewilding, parkland, leisure uses, all that sort of stuff, then there's not really much of an argument against that, I don't think.
Yeah, I feel like, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm just being an idiot, but I feel like I have always had a sense growing up in London that golf courses are ring fenced, you know, and like not accessible for me. And so I've never even bothered to look and see if I'm allowed to walk across them. And I've never even bothered to go that extra step to see if there's a cheap day for me. You know, it's just, I mean, you're asking a lot of the individual responsibility, aren't you, really? You'd kind of want to say to golf courses, you know, can you advertise? You need to advertise this on a billboard outside your golf course. Yeah, you know, come see us on open days. You know, it sounds crazy for open land.
Well, certainly the course that's closest to me in Barnet, it was entirely locked down. During lockdown, it was entirely closed. There were nobody playing golf. Nobody was allowed on it. It was maintained, but it was you know, it was entirely inaccessible. Now, other courses you can walk around across, depending on who owns them and how accessible they are. So it's not a binary picture, but in order to play, my calculations are such that, you know, one golfer requires around 1.6 hectares of space. You know, that's a huge amount for one golfer, you know, which is a huge amount of, you know, a huge disparity into compared to all other leisure uses. So that's my principal challenge, I think.
I'm gonna try and, while I've got time, bring in a couple more questions. Dinah, there was one specifically targeted at you about Hampstead Heath, and you know, apparently the questioner says that, you know, the teenagers travel from all over North London to meet up there. You know, so how comes this has this huge draw for them?
Yeah, this is my friend Maisie reminding us of what we used to do when we were teenagers. Go over to Hampstead Heath from quite a long way away. Yeah, I think exactly that's a really good example of a space, and Primrose Hill, but I mean Hampstead Heath is a much better example of a massive space. What's the attraction is the freedom, other young people, space to do what you want, no rules. That's not always what everybody wants, but it is something that a lot of teenagers are looking for at that time in their lives, when they haven't necessarily got anywhere to go. Like, you can't go to the pub, you can't, you know, there's all sorts of places you're not allowed, and you can't hang out at home with all your friends. So there's a real need for those kinds of spaces, and we see it in the Olympic Park as well, don't we? We see people coming and congregating in the early evening and using those spaces to do all sorts of things. And I think that perhaps Hampstead Heath does have a kind of one type, and that there is something to be said for being a bit more understanding of the different needs. But I mean, wouldn't it be great if, I know we've got the Olympic Park, but there was a new huge park in London like the Victorians used to build? I feel uncomfortable with the fact that we're creating so many pocket parks and slices and mews and tiny bits of green in the name of sort of improving and placemaking, but actually removing. And you know, somehow those golf courses are slightly invisible, aren't they? Because you don't know, you don't see they're there until you see them on a map. But the fact that they could create a great big park like Hampstead Heath, they would probably draw a lot of young people to it.
Yeah, I saw a report on BBC News that Mayfield up in Manchester was, they said it was the UK's only new urban park in 100 years, but can that be true? I don't think
maybe of a certain size. Yeah, that's what they're claiming.
Over a certain size, so someone's somewhere created the the criteria for what constitutes
an arbitrary threshold.
An urban park has to be this many hectares.
Yes.
We had a question for you, Bridget, from someone who works on the Camden High Line project, and they were sort of saying, obviously that's a new linear park for London, and they want it to be as inclusive as possible. So I guess they were sort of saying, where do you start doing that? How do you approach making something inclusive in the first place?
Well, like Dinah, talking to people would be the place that I would always start. I mean, I think one thing is we always really track who we are speaking to, and people will provide equalities information generally if you ask them to, and using the census categories isn't perfect, but people are quite familiar with them. And what we find when we do that is that we're able then to look at whether we've actually spoken to enough young people, or whether we've actually spoken to a representative sample of the British Bangladeshis that we know live in that area. And if we haven't, then we'll make some effort to reach out to organisations that are gatekeepers for people from that background, and at least through that means we're hoping to hear from everyone. Obviously, it's not always going to be perfect, but actually making an effort and reaching out and tracking who you have heard from, and then also through that seeing if there are differences in what people are saying. For example, recently we've been looking at differences in a small space in Hackney, and people who claimed black backgrounds in our equalities form were far more interested in social seating than they were in individual seating, and people who were claiming white backgrounds were very interested in individual seats. And the police were saying, well, we shouldn't have any social seats because that'll cause problems. And then that sort of thing means that certain groups in the community might not be getting the kind of green space that they want. And if we don't track who we've spoken to, we don't see that, because you might end up speaking to far more from one group than another, and you might then end up with information that doesn't really tell you about different voices in the community.
Yeah, I thought that sign you posted, Dinah, was interesting, saying that the playground was for under 12s only. But I actually thought it had very few what you can't do things. I mean, I've been to parks where the what you can't do list is almost like a sort of essay of pictograms, isn't it? And I just
it was actually quite interesting, because we pointed it out to the council and they were like, oh yeah, we've got to change the signage because we don't want it to just be for under 12s. And actually there was some sort of stuff at one end, although the teenagers pointed out that the basketball hoops were at the wrong heights, one was lower than the other or something. So it's like they could do a bit of tweaking and it would all be fine, but like a sign says a lot, doesn't it? And you can be much more positive and welcoming. And actually, when we were working with the group with young people with and adults with disabilities, they were just saying, well, like, our children are just an affront to society. Literally, they want to go into the playground and sit and watch the kids, but they're just classed as perverts. And so what do? Do we need signs up saying, actually be tolerant, be kind, this is a space for everybody, rather than don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that? That we don't do much of that, do we?
No, I think signs reminding people of behaviour can be quite good, because they can be empowering sometimes to people who may be scared to have a voice against that kind of behaviour. But if they can say, look, there's a sort of mandate here for how we should all be treating each other. It would be nice if you respected that. It sort of gives you a bit of maybe a bit more confidence to approach that. Was there anything else? There's so many. This is a really emotive subject.
Yeah.
There's so many comments. I mean, I think a big problem that comes with talking about development of green space is always that, well, let's just improve the parks we've got or build more parks. You know, I feel that there's a lot of people who've commented both on Twitter, you know, during the golf course thing and, you know, and tonight, who've sort of said, surely the last resort is building more housing on green space. Like that's the number one evil. But I mean, Russell, I think you said to me before that you wouldn't necessarily agree that that's true.
Well, I think the problem is that the debate becomes very polarized, and it, you know, some people will adopt a no tall buildings strategy. Some people will talk about, you know, we have to build on brownfield land, for example. But then you try and do that, and then you've got people, you know, objecting to building on suburban car parks, which is another very polarized debate that's taken place in the last few weeks. So, you know, none of those are a silver bullet. None of those solutions are going to solve the housing crisis. I think, you know, we need to adopt a sophisticated and mature approach to all of these things, and I would hope that, you know, limited development on green space, on golf courses or whatever, you know, that there surely must be a way that can also be an enabling development, can increase accessibility to open space by providing other facilities, for example. So it's not one or the other. I think, you know, we have to look at all of these solutions as a suite of tools that we have to meet the housing crisis. And also, it's not just about the housing crisis, it's also about mental and physical well-being, and, you know, the health of the city and sustainability. I mean, you know, it's a very complex picture, but I think we're all sophisticated enough to be able to, you know, to consider all of those different factors.
Yeah, I have to say there was one interesting example I've worked on of a project where the Metropolitan open land was kind of behind a fence, and therefore it became a very convenient fly tipping site. And so when a proposal to build on half of it and then have the other half as a dedicated pocket park for local residents, there was zero opposition, and they managed to convince the planning department that there was enough reason to build on Metropolitan open land. But that was, for a small development, that was an incredibly long, difficult and costly process, but just because of the MOL designation. Which it didn't need to be, because it had full local public backing.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we've talked about housing, but what about other? I mean, Ealing, for example, has a need for a new school, and it has MOL, which is owned by the council, not used for, you know, for very much, but you can't put any development whatsoever on MOL as it stands. So, you know, so can we, you know, are we really saying that we couldn't put a new school on MOL, or is there some kind of enabling development? That seems strange to me.
So I think I'm going to wrap it up there, because I'm just sort of completely overwhelmed. A forest school, someone said, yes, that would be a good idea. So I'm just going to say, Dinah, do you have any last thoughts of something you wanted to say?
I'm going to go for a very big walk on Saturday to the massive countryside of the Peak District, and I can't wait. Up near you, Bridget.
Yeah, just pop by and have a cup of tea.
It's very big. Thank you, everybody. That's my last word.
And Bridget?
Yeah, thanks very much for the discussion. I think that there was a lot of different kind of views and thoughts flying around there, and I think it's a really interesting topic to think about, those large green spaces and what might be the best thing for them. So thanks very much for the invitation. It's been a really interesting evening.
And Russell?
Oh, I probably said enough, haven't I? I mean, I just yeah, probably. No, I would just, you know, encourage everybody to, you know, to have a nuanced and, as I say, sophisticated discussion about these, because it becomes very emotive. But, you know, we're only going to be able to continue as a city, a successful city, if we have these debates.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I've really taken away from tonight is that there isn't such a thing as open space for all, because everyone is different. Everyone has different needs. Some people want to play golf. Some people, you know, want to focus on their kids running around unmolested animals, and other people want to walk those animals, which have their own health benefits and make them feel happy. So I think, yeah, as you say, the trick is just to talk to people, see what the needs are, and see if we can provide those. So thanks very much, everyone. And
thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yes.